The forest swallowed her whole, branches clawing at her threadbare cloak like the hands of the men she'd fled. Wren's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning with the kind of fire that spoke of miles already traveled and miles yet to go, and she couldn't hear the pursuit behind her. Not the snapping of twigs or the shouts of her father's guards, but she felt it in the tremor of the earth beneath her bare feet, in the way the air itself seemed to press against her back with the weight of inevitability. She had run before dawn, when the household still slept and the wedding gown hung like a corpse in her chamber, white silk that smelled of lavender and lies. They'd told her it was an honor to be chosen by Lord Garrett, that his wealth would erase the shame of her deafness, that a girl like her, broken, silent, unwanted, should be grateful for any man's hand. But Wren had seen the way Garrett looked at her, the hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with possession, with the twisted satisfaction of owning something beautiful and helpless. So she'd run. The forest thickened as she climbed higher into the mountains, the trees becoming ancient things with trunks wide as houses and roots that writhed across the path like serpents. Her feet bled, leaving dark prints on the moss, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The tremors in the ground had faded an hour ago, or maybe 2. Time was a fluid thing when fear was the only clock, but she knew better than to trust the silence she couldn't hear. Her father's men were relentless, and Lord Garrett didn't strike her as a man who accepted refusal with grace. The rain started without warning, fat drops that soaked through her cloak in seconds, and Wren tilted her face up to the sky, letting the cold water wash away the salt of her tears and the dust of the road. She was lost. Utterly, completely lost. The mountain path had disappeared half a mile back, swallowed by undergrowth and shadow, and now she stumbled through a wilderness that felt older than kingdoms, older than the memory of men. That was when she saw it. The castle rose from the mountainside like a bone emerging from flesh, all black stone and impossible angles, its towers piercing the low-hanging clouds with a kind of arrogant defiance. It shouldn't have been here. There were no castles in these mountains, no lords or kings foolish enough to build in a place where winter came early and never truly left. But there it stood, solid and real and terrifying in its sudden appearance. Wren hesitated at the edge of the tree line, her fingers curled tight around the rough bark of an oak that must have been standing when her grandmother's grandmother was born. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to find another path, to take her chances with the wilderness rather than whatever lived in that impossible fortress. But the rain was falling harder now, turning the world into a gray curtain of water, and her body was beginning to shake with a cold that went deeper than skin. She'd die out here. That was the truth of it. Die of exposure, or die caught by Garrett's men, or die alone and unmourned in a forest that didn't care whether she lived or fell. The castle, at least, offered walls. The gates stood open. That should have been her second warning, the first being the castle's existence at all. But Wren was beyond caution now, beyond anything except the desperate animal need for shelter. She slipped through the gates and into a courtyard that was empty of life, empty of sound, empty of everything except the rain hammering against ancient cobblestones and the sense that she was being watched by eyes she couldn't see. The main doors were massive things, oak-bound with iron that had rusted to the color of dried blood, and they opened at her touch with a silence that felt like a held breath. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of wood smoke and something else, something wild and dark that made the hair on the back of her neck rise in primitive warning. Torches burned in sconces along the walls despite the absence of any servants to light them, their flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose, with intelligence. Wren stepped inside and let the doors swing shut behind her with a boom she felt rather than heard, the vibration traveling up through the stone and into her bones. The entry hall stretched before her like the nave of a cathedral, all vaulted ceilings and carved pillars that depicted scenes she didn't want to examine too closely. Wolves tearing into prey, great beasts with human eyes, figures that were caught mid-transformation between one form and another. She should leave, should turn around and run back into the rain and take her chances with the wilderness and her father's men and Lord Garrett's cold hunger. But her legs wouldn't obey, and her body had gone still with something that wasn't quite fear, wasn't quite awe, but lived somewhere between the two, in a space she had no name for. That was when she felt it. Not a sound. She would never hear sounds again, not since the fever had stolen her hearing when she was 6 years old. But a presence, a weight in the air that pressed against her skin like a physical touch. The temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath came out in visible puffs, and the torches guttered as though something vast had passed by them, drawing all the heat and light into itself. Wren turned slowly, her heart a wild thing in her chest, and saw him standing at the top of the grand staircase. He was tall, impossibly tall, with shoulders that blocked out the light behind him, and a face carved from shadow and sharp angles that might have been handsome if they weren't so utterly, completely inhuman. His eyes were what stopped her breath. Not brown or blue or any color that belonged to mortal men, but gold. Pure, molten gold, like coins held up to flame, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, seen in a way she'd never been seen before. She couldn't hear him speak, but she saw his lips move, saw the way his hand lifted slightly as though to gesture her forward or push her back. She couldn't tell which. And then she saw something else, something that made the world tilt sideways beneath her feet. His eyes weren't just gold, they were glowing. Wren's body made the decision before her mind could catch up, her feet carrying her backward toward the doors she'd just entered through, but they wouldn't open. She pushed against the wood with all her strength, felt the smooth iron of the handle cold and unyielding beneath her palms, but the doors might as well have been part of the mountain itself for all they moved. Trapped. The word echoed through her thoughts like a death knell, and when she turned back to face the stranger on the stairs, he had moved. Not walked. Not descended the steps like a normal man would. He was simply closer now, standing at the base of the staircase where shadows pooled thick and hungry. And the impossibility of it made her stomach lurch with a fear that tasted like copper on her tongue. She pressed herself against the doors, her breath coming fast and shallow, and watched as he tilted his head in a gesture that was distinctly predatory, distinctly animal. His nostrils flared slightly as though scenting the air, and his eyes, those terrible, beautiful golden eyes, narrowed with something that looked like confusion, or perhaps recognition, she couldn't tell which. When he took a step toward her, the movement was liquid grace wrapped in controlled violence, and Wren felt the vibration of his footfall through the stone beneath her feet, like the approach of something far larger than the man-shaped form before her. He stopped 3 paces away, close enough that she could see the way the torchlight caught in his dark hair, the severe lines of his jaw, the breadth of his chest beneath a tunic that looked like it had been tailored for a king or a warlord. Close enough that his scent reached her, pine and smoke, and something wild that made her think of winter forests and blood on snow and things that hunted in the dark. His lips moved again, forming words she couldn't hear, and frustration flickered across his features when she didn't respond. He gestured sharply, a command or a question, and when she still stood frozen and mute, she saw something dangerous flash in those gold eyes, something that made her understand with absolute clarity that she was alone in a castle with a creature wearing a man's skin. But then his gaze dropped to her hands, still pressed flat against the door behind her, and she watched as his expression shifted. Not softening. Nothing about him seemed capable of softness, but changing. The sharp edges of his anger dulling into something that might have been understanding. He lifted his own hand slowly, carefully, and pointed to his ear, then to hers, his eyebrows raised in a question that needed no words. Wren nodded once, a jerky movement that felt like surrender. He exhaled, and though she couldn't hear the sound, she saw the way his chest moved, saw the brief closing of his eyes as though processing something unexpected and unwelcome. When he looked at her again, the glow had faded from his gaze, leaving only that impossible gold, and he gestured toward the fire burning in a massive hearth she hadn't noticed before. An invitation, or an order. With him, she suspected the two were interchangeable. She shouldn't go to him. Every instinct of self-preservation she possessed screamed at her to refuse, to find a window, to break through one of those impossible doors if she had to. But her body was shaking so hard now that her teeth chattered, her wet cloak clinging to her like a second skin of ice, and the fire looked like salvation, even if the man standing beside it looked like damnation. Wren peeled herself away from the doors and moved toward the hearth on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She kept her eyes on him, watching for any sudden movement, any sign that he would lunge for her the way Lord Garrett had lunged for her the one time she'd been foolish enough to be alone with him. But this stranger simply stepped aside, giving her clear access to the fire, and when she sank down onto the stones before it, her hands stretched toward the flames, he remained standing at a distance that felt almost respectful. Almost. The heat was agony at first, burning against her frozen skin, but gradually it seeped into her bones, and the shaking began to subside. She risked a glance up at him and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture that should have looked casual, but instead radiated coiled tension, like a wolf deciding whether its prey was worth the chase. He moved then, crossing to a table near the far wall, and returning with a blanket of dark wool that looked thick enough to stop a blade. He held it out to her, and when she hesitated, he simply dropped it onto the stones beside her and stepped back again, that same careful distance maintained. Wren wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and felt the warmth of it sink into her immediately, felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. Though whether it was gratitude or simply the body's response to no longer being on the edge of death by cold, she couldn't say. He was still watching her, still standing there like a statue carved from midnight and menace. And Wren realized with a jolt that went through her like lightning that she could feel his gaze the way she'd felt the vibrations of his footsteps. Not as sound, but as something more primal, more visceral. It was as though the air between them had become charged with a current she couldn't name, and every breath she took was filled with the taste of him, with that wild scent that made her think of things that should have terrified her, but instead made her skin prickle with something that felt dangerously close to fascination. She looked away first, unable to hold that golden stare any longer, and focused on the fire. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt strange here, slippery. Eventually, she felt the exhaustion of the day's flight catch up with her, felt her eyelids growing heavy despite every rational thought screaming at her to stay alert, to stay watchful. When she finally risked another glance in his direction, he was gone. The relief should have been immediate, overwhelming, but instead, Wren felt something else entirely. A strange hollowness, as though something essential had been removed from the room along with his presence. She pulled the blanket tighter and told herself it was just the shock, just the cold, just the desperate circumstances that made her feel his absence like a loss. She was wrong. The realization came as a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, a certainty that preceded logic. He hadn't left. He was still here, somewhere in the shadows beyond the fire's reach, and he was watching her with those terrible golden eyes that saw too much, that stripped away every defense she'd ever built and left her feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her wet clothes or her vulnerability. Wren turned slowly toward the darkness pooling in the corner of the great hall, and her breath caught in her throat. 2 points of gold gleamed back at her from the shadows, low to the ground. Too low. And they were growing larger, brighter, as something massive moved forward into the light. Not something, someone. But the shape was all wrong. The wolf was the size of a warhorse. That was Wren's first coherent thought as the creature stepped fully into the firelight, its massive paws silent against the stone floor despite their obvious weight. Black fur rippled across muscles that moved like water beneath skin, and those golden eyes, the same eyes that had stared at her from the man's face, burned with an intelligence that was entirely, devastatingly aware. She should have screamed, would have screamed if her voice had ever been something she trusted, if sound had ever been her weapon or her shield. Instead, she went utterly still, every muscle locked in a paralysis that was part terror and part something else, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and wanting to jump just to know what falling felt like. The wolf moved closer with steps that were deliberate, controlled, each movement a statement of dominance that needed no growl or snarl to communicate its meaning. It stopped just beyond the ring of firelight, close enough that she could see the silver threading through the black of its coat. The wicked curve of teeth behind lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl, or might have been something else entirely. Wren's hand had found a piece of firewood without her conscious decision. Her fingers wrapped tight around the makeshift weapon, even as some distant part of her mind recognized the absurdity of thinking she could defend herself against something that could tear her apart with a single swipe of those massive paws. But she held it anyway, held it like a promise she'd made to herself years ago, that she would never go quietly, never submit without fighting, never let anyone or anything take from her what she wasn't willing to give. The wolf's eyes tracked the movement of the wood, tracked the tension in her body. And then something impossible happened. It sat. The gesture was so incongruous, so utterly at odds with the predatory menace radiating from every inch of the creature's form, that Wren felt a laugh bubble up in her chest. Hysterical, inappropriate, desperate. The wolf tilted its head in that same gesture the man had used, and she understood with a clarity that bypassed logic and went straight to bone-deep certainty. They were the same, man and wolf, wolf and man. The stranger who'd offered her a blanket, and the beast that could kill her with a thought. The same eyes. The same presence that made the air feel thick and charged. The same scent of pine and smoke and winter that now surrounded her so completely she could taste it on her tongue. Shifter. The word rose from the depths of memory, from stories her mother used to tell before the fever took her hearing, and her mother decided a deaf daughter was too much burden to bear. Stories of men who became beasts, of creatures that walked the line between human and animal, of ancient bloodlines and magic that predated kingdoms. Stories she'd dismissed as fairy tales meant to frighten children into obedience. But fairy tales didn't have golden eyes that watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Fairy tales didn't make her heart race with something that felt less like fear and more like recognition, as though some part of her that operated below conscious thought had been waiting her entire life to see exactly this. A monster that was also a man, a predator that somehow made her feel safer than any human ever had. The wolf rose in a single fluid motion and padded toward her, and Wren's grip tightened on the firewood even as her body refused to move, refused to run. It stopped directly in front of her, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from its massive frame, could see the individual hairs of its coat, and the way its sides expanded with each breath. Slowly, carefully, it lowered its great head and nudged the firewood in her hand with its nose. The touch was gentle, impossibly, devastatingly gentle. And Wren felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she'd built between herself and the world, between herself and anything that might hurt her. Her fingers loosened, and the wood clattered to the stones, and the wolf made a sound she couldn't hear but felt, a vibration that traveled through the air and into her body. A rumble that might have been approval, or satisfaction, or something else entirely. Then it turned and walked back into the shadows, and between one step and the next, the shadows themselves seemed to fold around it, seemed to reshape and reform, and when they cleared, the man stood there once more. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling beneath his tunic, and there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before, something raw and exposed and almost vulnerable. He looked at her as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve, a riddle that defied every answer he'd ever known. Wren pushed herself to her feet on legs that shook but held, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and met his gaze with a defiance she didn't entirely feel. If she was going to die here, she'd die standing. If she was going to be trapped in this impossible castle with this impossible creature, she'd face it with her spine straight and her chin raised. His lips moved, forming words she'd never hear, and then he did something that shocked her more than the transformation, more than the golden eyes, more than any of it. He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, wasn't gentle or reassuring or any of the things smiles were supposed to be. It was sharp and dangerous and edged with something that looked like dark amusement, like he'd just realized something that pleased him in a way she suspected should terrify her. And when he turned and walked toward the staircase, then paused and looked back at her with one eyebrow raised in clear expectation, Wren understood that she was being given a choice. Follow him into the darkness of this castle, or stay here by the fire and face whatever came when morning arrived. Wren followed. Not because she trusted him. Trust was a luxury she'd abandoned the moment her father announced her engagement to Lord Garrett, but because staying alone in that vast hall felt like drowning slowly instead of diving deep. At least following meant movement, meant action, meant she had some illusion of choice even if they both knew she was already caught. He led her up the grand staircase, his movements fluid and soundless, and she watched the play of muscle beneath his tunic, the predatory grace that marked him as other even in human form. The castle seemed to breathe around them, the torches flaring brighter as they passed and dimming once they'd moved beyond, as though the building itself responded to his presence. The corridor he turned down was lined with portraits, and Wren caught glimpses of faces that all shared the same sharp features, the same golden eyes staring out from oil and canvas. A lineage, a bloodline, something ancient and unbroken that made her own humble merchant family seem like mayflies in comparison. He stopped before a door that was smaller than she'd expected, almost modest compared to the grandeur of the hall below. When he pushed it open and gestured for her to enter, she hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The room was warmer than the rest of the castle, a fire already burning in the hearth, as though someone had known she was coming. A bed dominated one wall, piled with furs that looked soft enough to sink into, and a small table held a pitcher of water and what looked like bread and cheese. Simple offerings, almost kind, if kindness was something she could attribute to a creature that had stared at her with the eyes of a wolf. He moved to the wardrobe against the far wall and pulled out a shift of pale linen, practical and clean. He laid it on the bed, then pointed to her wet clothes, to the shift, and then to the door. The meaning was clear. Change, and he would leave. But he didn't leave yet. Instead, he crossed to stand before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like a physical thing. He lifted one hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, to refuse, and when she didn't move, couldn't move, her body frozen under the weight of his attention, his fingers brushed against her jaw. The touch was fire and ice at once, a sensation that shot through her like lightning and left her skin tingling where he'd made contact. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about him, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Hunger, yes, but also confusion, as though he was trying to understand something that defied his expectations. Then he stepped back abruptly, his hand falling to his side, and she saw him clench his fist as though restraining himself from reaching for her again. He turned toward the door, and just before he left, he looked back at her one last time. His lips moved, forming words she'd never hear, but somehow she knew what he was saying. Mine. The door closed behind him with a finality that vibrated through the floor, and Wren stood alone in the warm room, her heart hammering against her ribs, her skin still burning where he'd touched her. She should have been terrified, should have been planning her escape, searching for windows or weapons or any way out of this impossible situation. Instead, she found herself lifting her own hand to her cheek, tracing the path his fingers had taken, and wondering why his touch had felt less like a threat and more like a promise. She changed into the shift with shaking hands, hanging her wet clothes near the fire to dry. The bread and cheese were fresh, impossibly so for a castle that seemed devoid of servants, and she ate because her body demanded it, because survival had always been her first priority, even when her heart wanted to give up. When she finally climbed into the bed, sinking into furs that smelled of pine and something distinctly animal, exhaustion pulled her under like a tide. But even in sleep, she felt him, felt those golden eyes watching her from somewhere in the darkness, felt the weight of his attention like a hand pressed against her chest. And somewhere in the space between waking and dreams, she understood with perfect clarity that running into this castle hadn't been an accident. It had been fate. the kind that couldn't be outrun, no matter how fast or how far she fled. Wren woke to the scent of him. Not in the room. The space was empty save for herself and the dying embers of the fire, but lingering in the air like a ghost, like he'd stood over her bed while she slept and simply watched. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it made something low in her belly tighten with an awareness she had no name for. A heat that had nothing to do with the furs wrapped around her body. She rose and dressed in her clothes, now dry and stiff from the fire's heat, and opened the door to find a tray waiting on the floor. Fresh bread, still warm, butter and honey, berries that looked like they'd been picked that morning, despite it being deep into a season when nothing should grow. No note, no explanation, just sustenance offered by invisible hands, and she wondered if he'd brought it himself. If those dangerous hands had carried something as mundane as breakfast to her door. The castle revealed itself slowly as she explored, each corridor opening onto rooms that felt both abandoned and inhabited, as though the building existed in two states at once. A library with books in languages she didn't recognize. A great hall with a table long enough to seat 100, a chapel with stained glass windows depicting wolves standing on hind legs, wearing crowns. She found him in the courtyard. He stood in the center of the space, shirtless despite the cold, his body covered in a sheen of sweat that caught the morning light. A sword moved in his hands like an extension of his body, cutting through forms that were both beautiful and deadly, and Wren felt her breath catch at the raw power on display. Every muscle was defined, every movement controlled, and the scars that crossed his chest and back told stories of violence survived, of battles won. He knew she was there. She saw it in the subtle shift of his posture, the way his neck strike angled slightly toward where she stood. But he didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge her presence beyond that small tell, and so she watched, transfixed by the lethal grace of him. When he finally lowered the sword and turned to face her, his chest was heaving, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and those golden eyes found hers with an intensity that made her skin flush hot despite the winter air. He gestured for her to come closer, and though every instinct warned her against obeying his silent commands, her feet carried her forward. He held out the sword, hilt first, and raised one eyebrow in challenge. Wren stared at the weapon, then at him, understanding clicking into place. He wanted to see if she could fight, wanted to know if she was prey or something else entirely. She'd never held a sword in her life. Her father believed weapons were unsuitable for daughters, especially broken ones, but she'd spent years learning to read faces, to anticipate movement, to survive in a world where she couldn't hear danger approaching. She took the sword. It was heavier than she'd expected, the weight of it dragging her arm down until she adjusted her grip. He moved behind her, and suddenly, his hands were on her body, one on her wrist, repositioning her hold, the other on her waist, adjusting her stance. The touch sent fire racing through her veins, made her acutely aware of every point of contact between them, of the heat of his bare chest nearly pressed against her back. His breath was warm against her ear as he guided her through a basic form, his body moving with hers in a way that felt intimate and dangerous. She couldn't hear his instructions, but she felt them, felt the pressure of his hands directing her movements, felt the approval when she followed correctly, and the gentle correction when she didn't. They moved together like that, sword forms becoming something else entirely, becoming a dance that was part combat training and part something far more primal. Every adjustment of his hands on her body felt deliberate, felt like he was learning her the way a wolf learns the territory it hunts. And then she felt it, that prickling awareness that said they were no longer alone. He felt it too. She knew because his entire body went rigid behind her, because his hands tightened on her wrist and waist almost painfully, because when she turned her head to look up at him, his eyes were no longer gold. They were black as midnight, and fixed on something beyond the courtyard walls. He moved so fast she didn't see it. One moment he was behind her, the next he was shoving her toward the castle doors with a force that sent her stumbling. The sword clattered from her grip, forgotten, and when she turned back to demand an explanation for words she couldn't hear, she saw them. Men, at least a dozen, emerging from the tree line with weapons drawn and faces set in grim determination. She recognized the colors they wore immediately. Lord Garrett's house, the green and silver that had haunted her nightmares. They'd found her. Somehow, impossibly, they'd tracked her through the mountains to this hidden castle, and the man at the front of the group made her blood run cold. Garrett himself. His handsome face twisted with furies, with the entitled rage of a man denied something he believed he owned. The shifter, she still didn't know his name, realized with a jolt that they'd existed in this strange intimacy without the basic foundation of names, stepped between her and the approaching men. His body was a wall of muscle and menace, every line of him screaming violence held on the thinnest leash, and even without hearing, she could sense the growl building in his chest, could feel the vibration of it in the air. Garrett was shouting something, gesturing at her, and though she couldn't hear the words, she understood the meaning well enough. He'd come to take back what was his, to drag her home and force her into a marriage that would destroy whatever remained of her spirit. The shifter's response was to bare his teeth in a mockery of a smile that promised blood. Then Garrett did something that changed everything. He pulled out a crossbow, one of the new mechanical ones that could punch through armor, and aimed it not at the shifter, but at Wren. She saw the shifter's body go utterly still, saw calculation flash across his features. He was fast, inhumanly so, but even he couldn't cross the distance between them before Garrett's finger tightened on the trigger. A standoff, then. Her life balanced against his compliance. Garrett's lips moved, forming words that were clearly demands, and the shifter's hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he would refuse, would let Garrett fire and deal with the consequences. But then those black eyes cut to her, and something in them made her chest constrict with an emotion she couldn't name. He stepped aside. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. He was letting them take her. After everything, after the blanket and the food and the sword training that had felt like courtship in its own twisted way, he was simply stepping aside and letting Lord Garrett claim his prize. Garrett's men moved forward, two of them grabbing her arms with grips that would leave bruises, and she fought them with everything she had, kicking and clawing and biting like the animal he'd shown her it was possible to be. But there were too many, and she was too small, and within moments they had her restrained. She looked back at the shifter as they dragged her toward the gate, searching his face for something, regret, anger, anything that said this mattered to him at all. But his expression was carved from stone, unreadable and distant, and when their eyes met, she saw nothing there but cold calculation. He'd never wanted her, had only tolerated her presence because she'd stumbled into his territory. And now that someone had come to remove the inconvenience, he was content to let her go. Whatever she'd felt in that courtyard, whatever connection she'd imagined between them, had been nothing but delusion born of desperation. The men hauled her through the gates, and Lord Garrett approached her with a smile that made her stomach turn. His hand came up to grip her jaw, forcing her to look at him, and his lips moved in words she was almost grateful she couldn't hear. But she could read the promise in his eyes well enough that she would pay dearly for running, that the wedding would proceed, that her defiance had earned her a lifetime of punishment disguised as marriage. She'd failed to escape, failed to build a life beyond the cage her father had constructed, failed to be anything other than a piece of property passed between men who saw her as less than human. The last thing she saw before they forced her onto a horse was the castle, dark and imposing against the mountain, and the man standing in the courtyard watching her leave with eyes that had returned to gold. Eyes that burned with something that looked almost like fury. But he didn't move, didn't fight, didn't do anything except watch as they took her away, and that inaction hurt worse than any of Garrett's threats ever could. They'd been riding for less than an hour when the first scream came. Wren felt it more than heard it, the vibration of terror that rippled through the men around her, the sudden jerking of horses fighting their reins, the way the air itself seemed to thicken with primal fear. She twisted in the saddle where they'd bound her hands to the pommel and saw Garrett's face drain of color as he stared at something behind them. She turned to look. The wolf that emerged from the forest was death-given form, larger even than she remembered, black fur bristling and lips pulled back to reveal teeth that gleamed like daggers in the morning light. But it wasn't alone. Behind it came others, 12, 24, a pack of wolves that moved with coordinated precision, and at their center, leading them like a king leading his army, was him. His eyes found hers across the distance, gold burning with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she understood with sudden, perfect clarity what had happened in the courtyard. He hadn't surrendered, hadn't let her go. He'd been waiting for them to leave his territory where human laws might still apply, waiting to follow them into the wilderness where the only law was fang and claw. Garrett shouted orders she couldn't hear, his men scrambling to form a defensive line, crossbows raised and swords drawn. But Wren had seen the shifter move, had felt the lethal grace of him, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that these men were already dead. The pack attacked. It was carnage. Beautiful, terrible carnage. The wolves moved like water, like shadows, like inevitability itself, and Garrett's men fell one by one beneath tooth and claw. She should have looked away, should have been horrified by the violence, but she couldn't tear her eyes from the black wolf at the center of it all. He fought like poetry written in blood, every movement efficient and brutal. And when one of Garrett's men got too close to where she sat bound on the horse, the wolf was there instantly, placing itself between them with a snarl she felt rather than heard, protecting her. Even in the midst of battle, even with enemies on all sides, he was protecting her. Garrett had dismounted, backing away from the slaughter, the crossbow still clutched in his shaking hands. When the black wolf turned its attention toward him, Garrett did the only thing he could. He aimed the crossbow at Wren. The wolf froze. For a heartbeat, the entire forest went still. Every wolf pausing mid-strike, every man holding his breath. Garrett's lips moved in words that were clearly threats, the crossbow steady despite his terror, and Wren felt a strange calm settle over her. This was where it ended then. Not in a forced marriage or a lifetime of misery, but here in the forest, caught between a monster and the man who'd tried to cage her. She looked at the black wolf and saw something flash in those golden eyes. Anguish, fury, helplessness. He couldn't reach Garrett before the bolt flew. Couldn't save her without losing her. So Wren made a choice. She threw herself sideways off the horse, her bound hands sending pain shooting through her shoulders, and hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. The crossbow bolt whistled through the space where she'd been, and in the moment of Garrett's shock, the black wolf moved. It was over in seconds. Garrett's scream cut off abruptly, and when Wren managed to push herself upright, dizzy and aching, she saw the wolf standing over Garrett's fallen form, its muzzle stained red. Then it turned to her. The other wolves had finished with Garrett's men and melted back into the forest as silently as they'd come. But the black wolf remained. It padded toward her slowly, and she saw the moment when its form began to shimmer, to shift, shadows folding around muscle and bone until the man stood before her once more. He was breathing hard, blood spattered across his bare chest and face, and when he dropped to his knees beside her, his hands were shaking as they reached for the ropes binding her wrists. "You're hurt." His lips formed, and even without sound, she could read the anguish in them. She shook her head, wanting to tell him she was fine, wanting to explain that she'd misunderstood, wanting. His hand cupped her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who'd just torn through a dozen men, and when he leaned forward, she felt his forehead press against hers. A gesture of relief, of something deeper than relief. His lips moved again, forming a single word. "Mine." And this time, Wren understood it wasn't a claim of possession. It was a confession. He carried her back to the castle, and she didn't protest, couldn't protest, even if she'd wanted to, because something had shifted between them in that forest clearing, something that went beyond words or hearing, or any of the ways humans typically connected. She felt him now, not just his physical presence, but something deeper, a thread that tied her awareness to his, that made her know without knowing how she knew that his heart was racing. That fear still coursed through him despite the danger being past. The bond. The thing from her mother's stories that she'd dismissed as fairy tale. It was real, and it was pulling them together like gravity, like inevitability, like fate itself had looked at two broken creatures and decided they belonged to each other. He set her down in his own chambers. She knew they were his by the scent that saturated the space, by the massive bed covered in dark furs, by the window that overlooked the forest like a predator surveying its territory. He disappeared into an adjoining room and returned with a basin of water and cloth, kneeling before her to tend the scrapes and bruises she'd earned in her fall. His touch was reverent. That was the only word for it. Each brush of cloth against her skin felt like worship, like he was trying to memorize every inch of her through his fingertips. When he found a particularly deep bruise on her shoulder, his jaw clenched and his eyes flashed black for just a moment before he controlled himself. Wren reached out without thinking, her hand covering his where it rested against her arm, and felt him go utterly still beneath her touch. She traced the scars on his knuckles, the calluses earned from years of sword work, the strength leashed beneath skin that was surprisingly warm. His eyes lifted to hers, and what she saw there made her chest tighten with an emotion that felt too large for her body to contain. Longing. Raw, desperate longing that echoed her own. He set the cloth aside and his hands rose to cup her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with a gentleness that made her want to weep. His lips moved, forming words slowly, carefully, and she read them with perfect clarity. I thought I'd lost you. The confession broke something open inside her. Some final wall she'd been maintaining against him, against this, against the impossible reality that she'd stumbled into a castle 3 days ago, and somehow found the one person in all the world who looked at her like she was precious. She couldn't tell him with words that she understood, that she felt the same pull, that the thought of Garrett taking her away had hurt less than the belief that he didn't care. So instead, she did the only thing she could. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The effect was instantaneous. His entire body went rigid, a shudder running through him that she felt echo through the strange connection binding them together. For a heartbeat, he remained frozen, as though afraid that moving would shatter whatever spell had made her bold enough to close the distance between them. Then he kissed her back, and the world caught fire. It wasn't gentle, wasn't tentative or questioning, or any of the things first kisses were supposed to be. It was hunger and desperation and 3 days of tension finally snapping, and when his hand tangled in her hair and his other arm wrapped around her waist to pull her closer, Wren felt something in her chest slot into place with the finality of a key turning in a lock. This was what the stories meant by fated mates, by souls that recognized each other across time and circumstance and impossibilities. This feeling of completeness, of rightness, of finally coming home after a lifetime of wandering lost. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers again, and his lips formed a single word. Stay. Not a command, a plea. And Wren realized that for all his power, for all his strength and dominance and predatory grace, he was just as vulnerable to this bond as she was, just as desperate for her to choose him. She nodded and felt his exhale of relief like it was her own breath leaving her lungs. But even in that moment of peace, of tentative acceptance, she felt something else, a prickling at the back of her neck, a sense of wrongness that made the newly formed bond between them pulse with warning. He felt it too. She knew, because his arms tightened around her, because his eyes went black as his head snapped toward the window, because she felt through their connection the surge of protective fury that meant only one thing. Someone was coming. Someone who made even an alpha king afraid. The woman who walked through the castle doors without knocking was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, all sharp edges and cold grace, with silver hair that fell like moonlight down her back, and eyes that were the same gold as his, but colder, harder, ancient, in a way that spoke of centuries lived. She looked at Wren the way one might look at an insect, then turned her attention to the shifter who'd positioned himself between them, his body a wall of protective fury. The woman's lips moved, forming words in a language Wren didn't recognize, but she didn't need to understand the specifics to grasp the meaning. This was pack business, alpha business, and Wren, human and deaf and utterly without power, had no place in it. The shifter's response was to reach back and pull Wren forward, his hand finding hers and gripping tight enough that she felt the tremor running through him. A statement, a declaration. She was his, and he was keeping her. The woman's face twisted with something that might have been disgust or might have been fury, and suddenly the temperature in the room plummeted. Ice formed on the windows, spreading in crystalline patterns, and Wren realized with dawning horror that this woman wasn't just another shifter. She was something more. The woman moved faster than sight, and suddenly she was there, her hand wrapped around Wren's throat, lifting her off the ground with impossible strength. Black spots danced in Wren's vision as her air was cut off, and she felt the shifters rage through their bond like a living thing, felt him starting to change. Then something else happened. Heat exploded from Wren's chest, white-hot and wild, and the woman holding her screamed, actually screamed, and dropped her. Wren fell to her knees, gasping, and when she looked up, she saw her hands glowing with a light that shouldn't exist, that defied everything she'd ever known about herself. The woman stared at her with something new in those ancient eyes. Fear and understanding. Impossible. Her lips formed. She's marked by the moon herself. Wren didn't understand, but the shifter did. She saw it in the way his expression shifted from fury to awe. In the way he looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. He dropped to his knees beside her, and his hand covered hers where it still glowed with impossible light. "You're not human," he mouthed. "You never were." The woman was backing toward the door now, all her earlier arrogance gone, replaced by something that looked like reverence. She said something else, gave what might have been a bow, and then she was gone, leaving them alone in the sudden silence. Wren stared at her hands as the glow slowly faded, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Magic. She had magic. Had always had it, perhaps, buried deep beneath layers of trauma and rejection, and the belief that she was broken. The shifter's fingers tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not fear of her power, but hunger for it. Not rejection of what she was, but acceptance of what they could be together. Mine. His lips formed. My mate, my equal, my Luna. Luna, Queen. The word resonated through her with the weight of destiny, and when he leaned forward to kiss her again, she felt the bond between them flare to life fully, completely, irrevocably. This was the claiming, the final acceptance, the moment when two souls became one. His teeth grazed her neck, a question, and she tilted her head in answer. When he bit down, not hard enough to truly hurt, but hard enough to mark, to claim, to seal, the world exploded into sensation. She felt him in every cell of her body, felt their souls intertwining, felt power rushing through the bond like a river finally allowed to flow. When he pulled back, his eyes were pure gold. And she knew without seeing that her own eyes now held the same light. They were bound, mated, complete. Spring came to the mountain castle like a benediction. Wren stood at the window of their chambers, no longer his, but theirs, a possession shared and cherished, and watched the forest below come alive with green. 3 months had passed since the claiming, since the moment her world had tilted and reformed around the truth of what she was, what they were together. 3 months of learning to use the power that sang through her veins, of understanding that her deafness had never been a curse, but a different kind of gift. A way of experiencing a world that made her uniquely suited to hear the voice of the moon goddess herself. Arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of him, feeling the now familiar rush of contentment through their bond. Kael. She'd learned his name that first night after the claiming, had traced the letters against his chest, and felt him shudder at the intimacy of being known so completely. His lips pressed against the mark on her neck. Healed now, but still visible. A silver scar in the shape of a crescent moon that proclaimed to anyone who saw it that she was claimed, protected, loved. She felt his question through the bond before he pulled back to where she could see his face. "The pack arrives tonight," he mouthed, and she read both anticipation and nervousness in his expression. The pack. His people. Their people now. They'd stayed away these 3 months, giving their alpha king time to bond with his unexpected mate. But tonight they would come to formally recognize her as Luna. The woman who'd attacked her, Kael's aunt, a elder of the Silver Moon pack, had spread word of what Wren was, and now wolves from across the territories were making pilgrimage to see the Luna marked by the moon herself. Wren should have been terrified. Would have been once, when she was still the girl who ran through forests to escape a forced marriage, who believed herself broken and worthless. But that girl had died in the claiming, and the woman who stood in her place knew her own power, knew her own worth. She turned in his arms and reached up to cup his face, feeling the scratch of stubble against her palms, the warmth of skin over the strong line of his jaw. His eyes, always gold now when he looked at her, the black receding unless they were in the midst of passion, softened with an affection that still made her heart skip. "I'm not afraid," she mouthed back, and felt his pride echo through their bond. He kissed her then, slow and deep and thorough, the kind of kiss that spoke of permanence, of forever, of a love that had bypassed logic and gone straight to soul-deep certainty. When they finally broke apart, he rested his hand against her stomach in a gesture that had become habit over the past few weeks. The cub growing inside her was barely more than a whisper of life, too early for anyone but them to sense through their bond. But they both felt it. A third heartbeat joining their synchronized rhythm, a future taking shape within her body. Their child, the next alpha, or perhaps a daughter who would inherit her mother's magic and her father's strength. A family. Something neither of them had believed they'd ever have. There was a feast that night in the great hall that had stood empty for so long. Wolves from a dozen packs filled the space with warmth and noise and life, and when Kael stood to present her, his hand firm and steady around hers, the entire assembly dropped to one knee in recognition. Luna, Queen, the woman who'd brought their isolated king back into the world, who'd reminded them all that the old magic still lived, that the moon goddess still blessed those who honored her ways. Wren looked out over the sea of bowed heads and felt something settle in her chest that she'd never felt before. Belonging. Not as property or burden or broken thing to be hidden away, but as herself. Powerful and chosen and exactly where she was meant to be. Later, when the celebration had wound down and they'd retreated to the privacy of their chambers, Kael pulled her onto the bed and into his arms, and they lay together in the comfortable silence that only those who communicated beyond words could truly appreciate. His hand traced lazy patterns on her stomach, and she felt through their bond his wonder at the life growing there, his fierce protectiveness, his bone-deep contentment. "Happy?" he mouthed against her hair. Wren tilted her head back to look at him, at the man who'd been a monster in her nightmares and become the safest place she'd ever known, and smiled. "Home," she mouthed back. "I'm home." And when he kissed her, slow and reverent and full of promises for all the years stretching before them, Wren understood that running into that castle had never been an escape. It had been the first step toward finding herself.